Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it, pushing us to our limits and revealing the strength we never knew we had. This is the story of Emily Rivers, a powerful CEO, and Jack, a young pilot, whose lives intertwine in the most unexpected way, on a deserted island after a plane crash. Together, they must navigate the harsh realities of survival, while discovering what it truly means to rely on each other. Join us as we share this incredible journey of transformation, resilience, and love. Life stories. Subscribe to the channel to start today's story. It was supposed to be a routine flight. Jack, a young and talented pilot with an impressive career ahead of him, sat at the helm of a sleek private jet. The warm glow of the midday sun danced off the polished surface of the plane as it sat on the tarmac, ready to soar through the sky. Jack adjusted his headset with practiced ease, glancing over his pre-flight checklist. Flying was more than just a job to him, it was his passion. "Ready when you are, Captain," his co-pilot, Ben, chimed in from behind him. Breaking his focused concentration, Jack gave a small nod, glancing toward the cabin. Their sole passenger, Emily Rivers, a highly successful CEO, was boarding. Even without seeing her face, Jack could feel her presence. She radiated power and confidence, a force that filled the entire space. Emily was known for her sharp intellect and unwavering determination. People often called her a workaholic, and those who had worked with her knew better than to challenge her when she set her mind to something. She was known for being demanding, and Jack wasn't sure if that reputation preceded her everywhere she went or if it was something she truly embraced. "Just keep things smooth," Jack muttered to himself under his breath. He had dealt with high-maintenance passengers like her before, those who saw the world and everyone around them as nothing more than tools to get what they wanted. As he ran his final checks and ensured everything was functioning as it should, he caught fragments of a conversation between Emily and her assistant. She was complaining about the charity gala she was attending and how it was a waste of her time when she could be finalizing an important merger. Jack couldn't help but shake his head. Typical VIP. Emily settled into her seat in the plush cabin, her tablet already in hand. Her fingers moved with precision across the screen as she answered emails, ignoring the world around her. Jack could sense the distance between them, both physical and emotional, and knew this flight wasn't going to be easy. But professionalism came first. His instincts told him that this might not be just another ordinary flight. But he pushed the thought aside. Once the plane was airborne, Jack focused on the skies ahead. The smooth ascent and calm atmosphere soon lulled him into a rhythm, the hum of the engines almost soothing. However, his attention was drawn to a blinking light on the instrument panel. A small anomaly, nothing serious, but enough to catch his attention. He checked the radar, his stomach dropping when he saw a storm system quickly developing in their path. "Hey, Ben, we've got a storm ahead," Jack said, his tone crisp and serious. "It's forming faster than expected." Ben's voice came through the intercom. "What's the plan?" Jack toggled the intercom, his voice cool but with a hint of urgency. "Miss Rivers, we've encountered some unexpected weather patterns. It's going to get bumpy, so I recommend you stay seated and fasten your seatbelt." Emily barely looked up from her tablet. "Noted. Just get me there on time," she replied in a distracted tone, as though the impending storm was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Jack sighed to himself. He'd heard it all before. Yet, despite his frustration, he remained calm, his instincts taking over. The turbulence started to pick up, gently at first, then growing in intensity. Overhead compartments rattled, and the cabin lights flickered. Jack's grip tightened on the controls as the storm ahead intensified. He checked the radar once again and saw that the storm was growing at an alarming rate. Suddenly, the intercom crackled, and Jack's voice came through with a note of urgency. "Mayday, Mayday, we've lost engine power. Preparing for emergency landing." Emily's assistant let out a sharp gasp. She clutched the armrest, eyes wide with panic, but Emily, unmoved, simply muttered, "Just focus on the press brief. Don't worry." Jack's hands moved with precision and skill. guiding the plane toward the small clearing he spotted below. Despite the chaotic vibrations of the plane, he was in control. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. But his exterior remained calm. Emily's eyes flickered briefly from her tablet, her face pale as the gravity of the situation set in. "We're going down," Jack said, his voice tight, but steady. "Brace for impact." The plane plummeted toward the earth, the rush of wind deafening, the shrill sound of warning alarms filling the cabin. Emily clung to her seat, her eyes wide with fear. For the first time in years, she felt completely powerless. Jack's calm demeanor was the only thing that kept her grounded. The impact of the crash was brutal, throwing both Emily and her assistant against their restraints. The plane skidded across the sand, its nose buried deep in the earth as smoke billowed from the damaged engines. The cabin fell eerily silent for a moment, the only sound the crackling of flames and the sharp scent of burning metal. Jack's voice broke the silence. "Is everyone okay?" There was no immediate response. But Emily slowly unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands trembling. She could feel the weight of the situation sinking in. The reality of what had just happened, the crash, the wreckage, the deaths of her assistant and Jack's co-pilot, was almost too much to comprehend. She looked around the cabin, trying to make sense of it all. But the sight of the mangled wreckage only brought her back to the one undeniable truth: she was stuck. Jack stepped out of the cockpit, his uniform rumpled, his face smeared with dirt, but his expression steady. "We're alive," he said, his voice calm, almost as though it were a statement of fact. "But we're stuck." Emily stared at him, disbelief and fear threatening to overwhelm her. She glanced at the wreckage and then at the dense jungle beyond. "Stuck?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "What do you mean, stuck?" "I mean," Jack said, gesturing to the wreckage, "we're on a deserted island. No one knows we're here. The radios are fried, and the plane's totaled." His voice was steady, but there was a weight to his words that made the reality of their situation settle in. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to feel vulnerable. She could no longer rely on her high-powered career or her carefully constructed image. Now, all that mattered was survival. And it was a truth that weighed heavily on her. The morning after the crash was harsh. Emily woke to the sound of crashing waves and the distant call of seagulls. Her body ached from the rough landing. The remnants of the plane scattered across the beach like forgotten relics of a life she had once known. The cold morning air bit at her skin. And as she sat up, her head throbbed from the disorientation. The reality of their situation hit her like a wave crashing against the shore. They were stranded, alone on a deserted island, with no clear way of knowing when, or if, rescue would come. Jack was already awake, standing by the edge of the beach, his eyes fixed on the horizon with a determined expression. His shirt was torn, and his face was smudged with dirt from the crash. But his calm demeanor was unchanged. He looked like someone who had been through this kind of thing before. And it both comforted and irritated Emily. She wasn't used to being in a position where she couldn't control things. But here she was, helpless and dependent on someone else. "Good morning, Sleeping Beauty," Jack said, his voice light but with an edge of seriousness. Emily groaned, sitting up and brushing the sand off her pants. "This can't be happening," she muttered, disbelief still clouding her thoughts. "Do you have any idea how long it's going to take for someone to find us?" Jack turned toward her, his expression calm but firm. "Hard to say. We're way off course, and the radio's completely fried. Until someone comes looking for us, it could take days or even weeks." He paused, allowing his words to settle before adding, "We need to focus on surviving." Emily's mind struggled to process the weight of it all. She wasn't a castaway. She was a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. She had meetings, deadlines, a life that required order and control. Yet here she was, stranded on an island with no idea of when, or if, she'd ever return to her old life. "I'm not a castaway, Jack," she said, her voice incredulous. "I have meetings, deadlines, work. I can't just be stuck here." Jack's eyes softened, but he remained focused. Unless you can conference call a coconut. Your deadlines will have to wait. He said it without malice. But the truth of it hit Emily hard. The world she had known, where everything was at her fingertips and her schedule dictated the pace of her life, no longer existed. Emily shot him a glare. But Jack was already moving. Stay here, he said. I'm going to scout the area. See if there's fresh water nearby. As the day went on, Emily tried to process the situation. She had never felt so helpless in her life. But when Jack returned, his arms full of coconuts, and told her about a small stream he had found in the jungle, Emily couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. There's fresh water a few hundred yards that way, Jack said, pointing toward the dense jungle. We'll need to build something to collect it. But it's a start. Emily wrinkled her nose in disgust. You expect me to drink from a stream? She crossed her arms in defiance. What about bottled water? There must be something left in the wreckage. Jack sighed, his patience thinning. Most of the supplies burned in the crash. What's left won't last us more than a day or two. This is our best option. Emily hesitated, her pride fighting against the reality of the situation. She wasn't used to doing things like this. She wasn't used to needing someone else. But Jack wasn't backing down. You seem to know a lot about this. Do you moonlight as a survivalist or something? I was a scout growing up, Jack replied simply, and I've been trained for emergencies like this. It's part of being a pilot. Good for you, Emily muttered under her breath as she sank down onto a piece of driftwood. Feeling the weight of her frustration, Jack studied her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Look, I get that this isn't the life you're used to, he said, but out here, we're equals. If we're going to survive, we both need to pitch in. So, are you with me or not? Emily's pride and frustration collided. She had always been in charge, had always commanded respect, but now, on this island, she had no choice but to rely on Jack. After a moment of silence, she finally exhaled, the fight leaving her. Fine, she said, her voice quieter. What do you need me to do? Over the next few hours, Jack patiently taught her how to crack open coconuts for water, weave palm fronds into a makeshift shelter, and even start a fire with scraps of metal from the wreckage. It wasn't easy. Emily struggled, her frustration often boiling over. She was used to control, to managing people, to making things happen, but here, in the harsh reality of survival, none of that mattered. She failed repeatedly in trying to start a fire, each attempt more frustrating than the last. This is ridiculous, she snapped, throwing the sticks down in frustration after her fifth failed attempt. Why do I even need to learn this? Isn't this your job? Jack's jaw tightened, but his tone remained even. My job was to get you to your destination safely. Since the plane's out of commission, I'm improvising, and so are you. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Emily glared at him, her frustration getting the better of her. Jack's eyes narrowed. No, I'm not enjoying this, but I am trying to keep us alive, which would be a lot easier if you stopped fighting me every step of the way. They locked eyes, the tension thick between them, before Emily finally looked away, her shoulders sagging. This is just not what I'm built for, she admitted, her voice quieter now, the weight of her pride crumbling. Jack's expression softened slightly, though he didn't let her off the hook. No one's built for this. Emily, you adapt, or you don't make it. That's how it works. By the time evening fell, they had managed to build a small shelter and start a fire. The flames crackled as they sat beside it, their exhaustion evident. Emily looked at Jack, a reluctant sense of gratitude rising in her chest. I guess I should thank you, she said, though it was grudging. Jack smirked. Don't strain yourself. But despite herself, Emily couldn't help but smile faintly. She had to admit, Jack's resourcefulness was impressive, and as they sat there, beneath the vast sky and the crackling fire, she realized that the island, this unlikely place, was changing her. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. The next morning, the storm arrived. It didn't roll in gently or build over time. It hit with an intensity that was almost immediate. What had started as a faint rumble of thunder grew louder, soon becoming a deafening roar as sheets of rain pounded the island. The wind tore through the trees, shaking the palm fronds loose, and the once calm ocean churned violently against the shore. The island, which had been their sanctuary of sorts, now felt more like a hostile environment. Jack was the first to react, moving quickly to secure their makeshift shelter. Emily scrambled to help, but she was no match for the force of the storm. The rain soaked through her clothes within seconds, and her teeth chattered from the cold. She could feel the weight of the storm bearing down on them. The urgency in Jack's every movement. This was no longer just about surviving the crash. It was about surviving nature itself. "Get down," Jack shouted over the deafening wind, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her under what little cover they had. The makeshift shelter wasn't much. Just a crude structure of palm fronds lashed together with branches. But it was all they had. They huddled together, drenched and shivering as the storm raged around them, the wind howling like a beast on the prowl. "What do we do?" Emily shouted back, her voice trembling from both the cold and fear. "We need to find higher ground," Jack said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "The shelter won't hold. We need to get inland." Together, they fought against the storm's ferocity, pushing forward through the rain-soaked jungle. The wind tore at their clothes, and the rain stung their faces like needles. But they pressed on. Every step was a struggle as the ground beneath their feet turned into a slippery mess of mud and wet earth. The trees groaned above them, their limbs creaking under the weight of the storm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached a cluster of trees further inland. Jack wasted no time in lashing together more branches and fronds to create a temporary shelter under the canopy of trees. The ground here was slightly elevated, and the shelter provided some protection from the relentless rain. They collapsed beneath it, gasping for breath. Emily's chest heaved with exertion, her body trembling not just from the cold but from the realization that they were truly alone in this. No rescue was coming, at least not anytime soon. But Jack had been her anchor through all of this. His calm, steady presence was a lifeline she never knew she needed. "How do you know how to do all this?" Emily asked, her voice softer now, the storm outside seemingly quieter as they huddled together under the shelter. Jack gave her a wry smile. "Like I told you, I was a scout growing up. It's about training and practice. When you're responsible for keeping people safe, you learn a lot." Emily nodded, still processing his words. She had always prided herself on being in control, on having the answers. But here, on this island, there were no answers. There was only survival, and survival required more than just intellect or authority. It required adaptability, resilience, and, most of all, trust. "Thank you," Emily said softly, looking at Jack with a newfound respect. "I didn't think I could do any of this. But I couldn't have gotten this far without you." Jack's gaze softened, and for the first time, Emily saw him not just as a pilot or a survivalist, but as someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. She had been so focused on her own world, her own life, that she hadn't realized the importance of the connections between people. But here, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the two of them, she was beginning to understand. The storm raged on for hours. But inside their small shelter, Jack and Emily found a moment of calm. The howling wind outside became a distant hum as they sat in silence, huddled together for warmth and comfort. Emily glanced at Jack, noticing the way his eyes seemed to soften when he looked at her. As if, for the first time, he wasn't just seeing the CEO who was always in charge but the woman who was vulnerable, who had been stripped of her armor. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't in a long time, vulnerability. And for the first time since the crash, she wasn't afraid of it. "We'll make it through this," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, filled with a quiet certainty that Emily couldn't help but admire. "I hope so," Emily replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure if she believed him entirely. But as she looked at him, she realized that hope was something they both needed. And right now, in the middle of the storm, Jack was her reason to believe in it. The storm eventually passed, leaving behind a soggy, unsettled world. Their shelter was battered, but still standing, and the air felt fresher after the violent outburst of nature. Emily sat by the fire Jack had managed to start, the crackling flames casting long shadows on the sand. She couldn't help but smile faintly. The island had taken so much from her already, her sense of control, her pride, her certainty, but it had also given her something she hadn't expected, a sense of connection. And with that connection came the possibility of something more. As the night settled in, Emily's thoughts wandered, not to the challenges ahead, but to the unexpected moments of solace she had found with Jack. Perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't as alone as she had once believed. As the days passed on the island, Emily and Jack grew closer. What began as a partnership born out of necessity slowly blossomed into something deeper. They shared stories of their lives before the crash, their hopes, their fears, and the dreams they had set aside in the chaos of survival. The island, with all its challenges and hardships, had become a place of transformation, a place where both learned that resilience was not just about surviving the storm, but about finding strength in each other. The day of their rescue arrived quietly, almost as if the island itself knew they were ready. As the helicopter descended, the sound of its blades slicing through the air was the sweetest music Emily had ever heard. With Jack beside her, she climbed into the helicopter, her heart full not just with relief, but with something more, a profound sense of gratitude and love for the man who had stood by her through everything. Back in the world they once knew, life resumed its frenetic pace. Emily returned to her high-powered career, but the experience on the island stayed with her. She had found a new perspective on life, a deeper understanding of the importance of human connection. Jack, too, resumed his life as a pilot, but the memories of the island and Emily lingered in his thoughts. Months later, Emily invited Jack to a gala she was hosting, publicly thanking him for saving her life in ways she had never expected. The crowd watched in awe as she expressed her gratitude, but to Emily, the moment was about more than just words. It was about acknowledging the bond that had formed between them. As the night drew to a close, Emily and Jack stood together on the balcony, their hands intertwined, knowing that their journey was far from over. It had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story of resilience, love, and transformation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on more inspiring life stories. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next video. Keep believing in the beauty of the human spirit.